Now, in keeping, those of you who do know me know that I do have a bit of an unusual sense of humour. And in keeping in line with that bit of a twisted sense of humour, I have a few photos to begin this morning with, all from the category of you had one job. First one, please. I think the one there. Yes? Yes, first one. Interesting design choices. I'm not quite sure how you'd get to the balcony, and let's just hope there's no fire in that place. Next one. I wonder why the doors won't open in that stairwell. And can anyone pick what's wrong? And it's a bit hard to see, but can anyone pick what's wrong with the compass on the pillows? Yes, it reads north, south, east, west, clockwise. I don't think I'd be wanting to follow that particular compass. And looking at the safety in the bottom one, anyone pick what's going wrong safety-wise in the bottom one? It's a whole stack of gas cylinders on a tank and they're doing welding. Nothing could go wrong there. Now this one here. This is why you need young people in church and on the advertising committee and the advertising team. Nothing wrong with having worship, teaching, and friends in church, just need to make sure we get it right. And I think that kind of salad is exactly the kind of salad I could get behind. It's amazing how people can have one job and completely stuff it up, and sometimes not even realizing that they are stuffing it up. Now, when I read 1 John, among other passages, I kind of get these pictures come into mind. You see, if I were to sum up the message of 1 John, it would be this. You had one job, love. But what the? We really can't understand this passage unless we put the passage that we just read from into context. And it doesn't make a lot of sense unless we read the preceding few verses, commencing at verse 11. There we see that this passage in John is John contrasting his understanding of love with his understanding of hate. Despite the church having only just started, and despite having been so close to actually hearing the teachings of Jesus on love, there are people who believe that we need to obey certain laws and do certain things to prove that we are saved. I suppose the modern equivalent is people who believe you must be baptized and that you must tithe in a particular way, that you must live a particular lifestyle, that you wear your clothes in a certain way, etc., etc. These are the kind of people who might get up and preach a sermon full of guilt and shame and then give the altar call and have hundreds of people flocking to the altar, convicted of how wretched they are. Come across people like that before? People who demand proof that we're saved? I can kind of picture John looking at these people, shaking his head and saying, whatever the ancient equivalent of WTF was. He's essentially saying, how can you get it so wrong? One more time for the dummies. Let's go back to basics. John equates the ideas and teachings of these people with living and death. And by contrast, he now, in this passage, explains what love is. It's the title of the sermon series for the book of 1 John, Love Made Known. How do we know what love is? The way John begins his explanation is a little off-putting and confusing. He begins by talking about laying down your life. No, he's not talking about the gift of martyrdom, that gift you can only demonstrate once. Nor is he talking about constantly putting yourself last in everything, sacrificing everything you have and doing it tough. I've often heard preachers and teachers describe that behavior as the spiritual gift of martyrdom in everyday practice. But let me tell you, it's not. that's just being a doormat and leads to all kinds of abuse. Nowhere in Scripture do I read that we are called to be doormats for Jesus. What John is talking about is using whatever resources we have to care for our siblings. Those who don't use their resources to care for those in need are the ones living in death. And when I read that, I hear two passages from the Gospels ring in my ear. The first, Jesus saying in Mark 7:10-13, "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother.' But you say that if anyone tells father or mother whatever support you might have had from me is Corban, that is, offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus nullifying the word of God through your traditions." See, giving to the church and doing things for the church is no substitute for loving your fellow human, which was an instant rebuke to those who were saying you need to do X, Y, Z to be saved. To love is to help your fellow human. And of course, the answer as to who our fellow human or neighbor is dealt with conclusively in the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you do not help your fellow human, you do not love. And if you do not love, you hate and are living in death. Pretty strong language, but that's what love is. And that's how we know we love. It's doing what we can with the resources we have. And I think that's what John is getting at here when he talks about laying down our lives, not physically, but putting aside our selfish ambition and focusing on lifting others up. When we use our position to give voice to the voiceless, that's love. When we speak out against injustice, that's love. When we sit with others in their time of need, that's love. When we provide whatever physical support that's within our power to those in need, that's love. That's how we know the Spirit of God, and the love of God abides in us. Not by our measurable devotion in a set of rules and regulations. Remember, it was in the parable of the tax collector. It was the tax collector the Pharisee and the tax collector. It's the tax collector who went away, who was seen as right with God, not the Pharisee who was able to prove how well he followed the rules and regulations. If you have not love, you know not God. So you have one job, and that's love. One of the problems that arise when we focus on rules and regulations, when we focus on external proofs that we are saved, is we misunderstand what love is. We assume that by pointing out one's faults, we are showing love. Ever heard someone say something like, "I love you too much to tell you how awful a person you are"? What about, "I love you, but there's this one thing about you"? Ever heard that? That's not love. That's abuse. Or at the very least, it's guilt and shame. Unfortunately, this kind of abuse is couched in terms of the movement of the Spirit. Ever come across this old gem? "The Spirit has laid it upon my heart to say this to you." We see from John's letter that this sort of abuse and manipulation has been going on well before the rise of certain denominations. And that's what John is referring to when he speaks about our hearts condemning us. Much like today, the teaching that was beginning to permeate the early church focused on guilt and shame, and so their perception of the reality of their salvation was altered. The focus was placed on obedience to certain laws and external signs of supposed salvation. If you haven't been baptized, you're not saved. If you don't give a certain percentage of your income, you're not saved. If you don't live a particular way, you're not saved. We hear it so much that we begin to believe what we're told. We feel guilt and shame. I should have given more to the church, which often leads to living in poverty and denying the needs of our family. I should deny this part of me, which, believe me, often leads to different kinds of mental ill health. I should abandon my friends so that I can go on this ministry campaign, or do this activity within the church, or develop only church-going friends, which can result in feelings of isolation. I've actually seen pastors say that, and it's had catastrophically disastrous effects. And the list goes on and on and on to the point that we begin to judge ourselves, and our hearts or our consciences condemn us out of guilt and shame. With my clients in my practice as a psychologist, one of the two words I ban in my sessions is the word should. It leads to judgment, guilt, and shame. And the author Anais Nin describes shame as the lie someone told you about yourself, which I think is quite a good understanding of shame. And in this case, it's the lie that you aren't saved or loved because you feel guilty, that you're not worthy of love and therefore have to prove yourself. John completely refutes this shame and guilt and judgment by saying that we have the guarantee of the Spirit which testifies to our salvation and the reality that we are loved. See, people said the same things back then as they do today. I'm not a good enough Christian because I don't do enough for the church. The Spirit says you are loved. I'm such an awful person because I had an angry thought or used that word I'm not supposed to use. The Spirit says you are loved. No one could possibly love me because I've been told how awful I am. Is the message not clear? You are loved. And after telling us how much we are loved, no matter what, John moves on to our response to that love and our job. Again, the message here is often misinterpreted. John says in verse 23, and this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. He's not saying that we need to simply believe that Jesus is the Son of God, as I've often heard preached. When John talks about believing in the name of God's Son, Jesus Christ, he is talking about so embodying the character of Jesus that we become like him in the way we live and act and love. We become Jesus to those around us. And we do it not because we are commanded to do it, or not just because we're commanded, but because it is our response to experiencing the love of God. If we have the love of God, if we have the Spirit dwelling within, then we will love. Simple as that. Or is it? You know, it can actually be quite hard to love. It can actually be quite hard to love others. And see, John is right in saying that this commandment is not a new commandment, and that this way of living is not a new idea. In Matthew 22, 34-40, Jesus is questioned by a Pharisee about which is the greatest commandment, to which he responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We often miss the point of Jesus' answer. Jesus is saying that in order to love others, we need to first love ourselves. In fact, we cannot love others if we don't love ourselves, because we will only love others as much as we love ourselves, and to love ourselves and others is to love God. If you take issue with that, and if you don't believe that, talk to me afterwards. But that's what I truly believe. We can't love others unless we love ourselves. And that can be pretty hard, particularly if we've been told all our lives how unlovable we are, particularly if we've been told all our lives how broken and in need of fixing we are. So perhaps that's why John spends so much time talking about love. What John is saying is not new. We can even trace it right back throughout the Old Testament, but it requires us to silence those voices that manipulate us into feeling shame and guilt. It requires us to challenge the voices that tell us we are not loved, or that we are broken, or whatever else we have been told, or whatever else has been done to us throughout our lives that has left us feeling as though we can't love ourselves. It requires us to know that we are loved by God, and it requires us to love ourselves. Hear again the message of John. You have one job: love. Love yourself and love others. By this we know that God abides in us and that we have the Spirit in us.